Hello, everyone. I'm Frank Garza with Lean Startup Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the webcast. Today's topic is building products for maximum impact, and moderating the discussion is our own Lean Startup Company faculty member, Elliot Susel. Our guest is Vasily Starostenko, who leads the customer acquisition team at Tesla. And with that, I'll hand things off to Elliot.
Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is Elliot Susel, Senior Faculty Member at Lean Startup Company, and today we have the pleasure of chatting with Vasily Starostenko, who has led the customer acquisition team at Tesla and also did product management at Uber, specifically focusing on growth of the driver side of their market. We're going to be talking today about building for impact. What does that even mean, and how do we do it? We're really excited to have you on the webcast today, Vasily.
Awesome. Thank you for such a great introduction, Elliot. My pleasure.
So to get the context, the way that you think about building for impact, I think before we even define it, I want to talk a little bit about your background. How did you get to where you are today, and how do you approach problems?
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question. And to start with, I'm obviously coming from Russia, and I moved to the United States roughly 10 years ago. So my product journey has started way before I came to the US in Russia. And I guess my beliefs started to form way before the product journey has started, right? Mm-hmm. And the way I currently think about products is, yes, you build products to make an impact. And what impact means is you genuinely try to solve the customer problem and you try to make people's lives better. And I basically got there by my real life because every one of us has lots of problems in our lives, right? And some of those problems are just not being solved by any products, but sometimes there is a nice, handy product that comes into your life and it just makes it so much easier. And again, I didn't have the easiest life growing up and had lots and lots of different issues and problems, and some of them were obviously of financial nature. So when I realized that, actually products and internet specifically, it was just getting born at the time, can actually solve lots of our problems. They can reduce transaction costs. They can make us save money. They can help us make more money. So I was really excited about the potential of internet and products specifically to help people be more financially successful by helping them spend less, for example, right? And the very specific first company I joined, it was back in 2003, which is 15 years ago, seems like forever ago, was all about IP telephony. And that company, it was a small startup in Russia, and it solved my specific problem, which I had. I couldn't call my family, right? Because it was very expensive. I came from Siberia to study in Moscow, and the call, a single minute of a phone call was quite comparable to my whole scholarship. I guess if I talked on the phone for an hour, I would probably spend whole my scholarship for the month. So that was basically the magnitude of the problem you're facing when you cannot even call your family and you're out. You can come visit only once every 6 months or every 12 months. It's a pretty big problem. So you get excited about the company that can solve it for a fraction of a cost, or ultimately to make it completely free. Like Skype was, again, basically being founded exactly roughly at that time, 2003, 2004. So all of those magic things were just happening. So that was my story of getting into the product. So telephony got me in. And for this company, I basically worked for 5 years. We did lots of exciting things. We created a switch which allowed big traffic carriers to send lots and lots of minutes from one country to another. So it was a huge exchange, which allowed lots and lots of people make phone calls, millions of phone calls each month. So it was technically a small startup, but processing lots and lots of activity. And I also had the luxury of, again, launching my first successful consumer product at that time, which created an even bigger taste for I really now want to make even bigger impact, and I want to have a lot of customers. So that was a small phone dialer. We did call it Luna phone. Luna is basically moon, and it means call even to the moon. I can even remember right now, we made it the slogan call anywhere, and it's going to be super cheap. And the product took off quite nicely in quite a number of countries. So it was global. It was not even focused in Russia. We didn't even have, I guess, almost any customers in Russia. It was very successful in the Middle East. It was producing millions in run rate in revenue at its peak. And at some point, it was even blocked by a local government. So we did get to some reasonable level of success. So that was my first.
For someone who is focused on really solving problems and that transition from sort of their upbringing to then their work, that's got to be so rewarding to see the impact of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So that's the first taste. And that's, I guess, very important, because if you get a taste of success early on, even if it's not a Google type of success or Facebook type of success, I still think you keep it and you really want to repeat this type of feeling, right? It's maybe drug comparison is not the best comparison, but you get it and you're kind of now addicted to it. And again, the success doesn't happen to you every year. Life sometimes may give you like several hard years before you get to next story like this. But for me, it just happened very early, and it made me believe, okay, now I want more, like give me more. And that was the decision behind, okay, how do I get more? Well, Silicon Valley is the place where most of success is happening. And now I guess Silicon Valley valuation wise in S&P 500 is more than 50%. So like pretty much it's fair to say now everything is happening in Silicon Valley these days. Not just technology, but like business in general, right? Because those biggest companies are much bigger than non-IT companies. So it was a fair choice and a fair bet to say that if you want bigger impact, go to Silicon Valley.
So to that end, spoiler alert, we already said you have worked at Uber and Tesla. So you went to Silicon Valley.
Correct. So my first reason to come was actually coming to Stanford for an MBA. I didn't come to work. I came here to study.
Yeah.
So in that, again, that was a separate story. 2 fantastic years. You see so much. You see like Eric Schmidt come teaching to us, some famous billionaires come teach. So it's just very different. For a guy from Russia, it was like, man, you definitely want to stay here. And since then, I don't want to talk too much about Stanford, but since then, I've done 4 different things. I've launched my own startup, and I've done it for 2 years, but I had to unfortunately move on simply because of like visa restrictions and stuff like this. They require you to be in a lot more stable place, but the company is still going, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be a good success story sometime soon as well. And then I worked for a startup, which is reputation.com. It's a startup company, but raised close to $100 million. So it's like a real business. And there was some ability for me to make impact there as well, quite on substantial scale. And the biggest stories as of now is obviously Uber and Tesla. Those are like super, super special companies. I guess everyone adores most, like both Tesla and Uber, and those companies solve our problems to such an extent that like you really want to learn how they do it at a completely ridiculous scale, right? Like the billions of 10 billion trips at Uber, Tesla is doing billions and billions of miles on autopilot. Like those companies are just so fantastic. So it's a privilege to work for them.
Yeah. So if I were to summarize your background, growing up, big focus on getting outcomes as you're solving problems. Then early in your career, experienced kind of an explosive growth company, and then continued to experience that as you moved into Silicon Valley at both Uber and now you're leading customer acquisition at Tesla. So to that end, let's start to define this term. And this is really what I want to focus in on in our webcast is getting outcomes with product management and how we create organizations that are focused on getting outcomes. Because I don't know if you have observed this, but certainly in the consulting that I have done, I've seen a lot of organizations put emphasis on building stuff,
right,
but not enough emphasis on what outcome they got by virtue of building things.
Right.
And so they celebrate when they launch a new feature or a new product or a new service or whatever, instead of celebrating whether or not they actually got the desired outcome. So talk to me a little bit about how you define this sort of building for impact and what it means for you and the places you've been at.
Awesome. And thank you for this question. It's an amazing question. And to be completely upfront, I actually do think that process also needs to be celebrated. So the way we got there and what we launched always needs to be celebrated, even if there is no specific impact. But to me, impact is a star. And in life terms, you can compare, is life a journey or a destination? It's a basically very philosophical question. Many people say it's a destination. You want to get into the best place by the end of your life. So you just need to accomplish something in your life. And some people just disagree and they say, no, it's a journey. I don't want to try to get like the most famous product manager or the most most famous musicians. I just want to enjoy my life and I want to be successful and maybe helpful to some other people. But to me, it's a journey. So I think there is this analogy works to quite a bit of an extent in the product world, because some organizations serve different purpose, right? There is not every company wants to become a Google or Facebook and just be the biggest company in the world and solve the biggest problem and make the biggest impact. But obviously, like companies like Google and Facebook, they wouldn't be so successful if they did not know how to solve for impact. So both things, from my standpoint, make total sense. I am more of a person who wants to, again, work for companies that maximize this impact, right? If you compare a small startup which just does small, nice thing versus a huge corporation that solves for impact, it's my personal choice to go for this destination and not necessarily optimize for the journey. But I can understand that some people and some companies celebrate, again, the process. It's not because they're wrong, it's because it's their choice. Sometimes it's a conscious choice, but it's not a choice which helps them to get into the best destination, if we can put it this way, right?
Sure. So talk to me a little bit more about what we mean by building for impact. What does that mean to you, and how does that work at a place like Tesla?
Yeah, that's another great question. So as I'm basically hitting now more than 10 years in product, so things are coming together in my head. So there is 3 attributes I would say I distinguish for myself that you need to be doing well to build for impact. And let me just share them with you up front, then we'll discuss which of them we would like to talk about in the most, at the largest level of detail. So first item is to understand the customer problem. And this one, lots of companies and product managers have issues with. Very specifically, to give you a failure example is, yes, when we just launch a feature and we celebrate the feature launch, it often happens that we do not even ever explicitly talk about, like, what problems did this feature, what problem was it launched to solve, and what problems has it actually solved? Like, how many customers used it? What was the impact on those customers' lives? And things like this. So identifying the problem first. And for everything you do to have an explicit problem statement, ideally you need to have a problem statement from customer standpoint, because your company exists and your product exists to satisfy the customer need. Sometimes you also do the things which don't immediately solve customer problems, but they may be solving your company problem. For example, like growth is a great example where, like, customers do not need growth, right? Customers maybe want your company to stay alive and offer good products, but they don't really want the company to grow. Your investors and maybe some of your employees want the company to grow. So for some of the things, the problem is not a customer problem, it's a company problem, but still it comes first. That's number one thing.
Number one. So to summarize, number one, focused on impact and impact with our products, is honing in on the customer problem. And I think you hit on something really interesting here, which is the problem we have set out to solve versus what have we actually solved.
Correct.
What actually is the outcome from what we've done.
Correct.
And the other thing you said that I made a couple notes here that I thought was really interesting was the company problem versus the customer problem.
Yes.
Awesome. Let's get to number 2.
Let's get to number 2. And before we get there, so what I do now, and again, Uber is now very famous. And then again, I think Google as well, and probably Facebook as well, problem always comes first. In fact, when you write the product spec, the first phase of even identifying the company problem is probably the toughest phase for the product manager to go through, because your product idea may be basically killed or may not even make it through the product problem statement, because your peers will just say the problem is fake, show me the evidence, and like you will never even get to solutioning. And many organizations and many product managers just skip through this step completely and let's just say, oh, let's solve for this. Like, how about this? How about this solution, by the way? Not even let's solve for this. Let's implement this solution to a problem we have never even discussed. So yeah, it's a big problem on the way of building impactful things. Second one.
Well, actually, let me build off that, because you hit on something really fascinating here. So in places where you've worked, step 1, you define the problem. And what you also mentioned is that there's some amount of consensus around the problem being real.
Right.
And the thing that is used to determine is it real or not is data.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. So data, that's a good question. So we're actually coming there in my number 2. So data as well as qualitative insight. So data is not everything. It's a very important part of your job, but it's not everything. And we're going to get to some of the if not catastrophes, but not so success stories, even when you use data, you can still get in a pretty bad place if you don't use the right kind of data, and if you do not use things beyond data, which are also very important to use. So second thing, I usually call it experimentation, but it comes like experimentation is a framework where you believe that the world is more complex than what you can possibly like understand about it, right? And you always have hypotheses, and you run an experiment which can prove you right or wrong. So it's a scientific approach to life, right? That's even if you think customer problem first, that second item is very important because sometimes this customer problem doesn't even exist, right? You might have an evidence for it, but somehow this evidence was just misused. It was evidence for some other problem which you haven't identified. And this experimentation approach and framework can help you, if not be completely safe and always successful, but it can help you, again, minimize the amount of like number of wrong decisions you do and minimize like damage and maximize the impact on your customers. And it comes with a sizing, right? You need to be sizing all the problems you're trying to solve. For some of them, you don't even want to launch those experiments because it turns out to be a much smaller problem than you originally thought. You need to be able to measure the outcome. So each experiment comes with success metrics, right?
Yeah.
And those success metrics, they need to be measured. So that's also very important. And then each experiment, which is also very important, it needs to be, I call it called, right? So you need to call it a success or a failure. And that's also not always a science. It's more of an art because there is a science part to it where you run it for a certain period of time. You have a control group, you have a treatment group, and then you look into the difference between the two and statistical significance of the difference. But that also by itself is, again, it's all good and great, but it still does not guarantee you because you get into a great place. And let me give you a clue why. So this whole experimentation framework makes you a lot more informed and makes you a lot more receptive on what real life is, but it's in nature, it's a backward looking type of decision-making framework where you do something, you observe the result, and then you believe that based on this result, I can keep doing something in the future based on what I'm observing. So by looking at the data, you cannot always know what's going to be happening in the future, right?
Yes.
Because data shows you the past. So to get the grasp of future, you need to be always thinking of like qualitative method, like talk to your customers, figure out what happens in customer support. So you need to always be on full alert for what am I not measuring, but might be happening here.
Yeah. So you hit on something really interesting here, which is when people run experiments, and now I'm sort of referring to lean startup style experiments, a couple things that we typically do is to write down our hypothesis.
Yeah.
And we've basically taken some belief about the world and quantified an outcome we would expect from the experiment so that, to your point, we can prove it true or false. Based on the experiment we ran, is the hypothesis true or false? But what I hear people often say is, aha, we ran the experiment, I have validated that it's right, or invalidated our belief. And the misconception there, I think, and you touched on this, is that we have conclusively proven it is true or untrue. Yeah. And that's not the case. We've got a pointer, right? We've got a leading indicator that perhaps we are headed in the right direction. Yeah. We can be more confident because we've collected this data, but that doesn't mean it's 100% guaranteed that, it's correct. The path is true, right?
Yes, it's a perfect point. So by running an experiment, like I started with the word hypothesis, right? You always have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis cannot be confirmed by an experiment. That's also this is more like philosophical and deep point. I'm really happy we even got there in this conversation. So the hypothesis may not be rejected at a certain significance level, right? So the best you can do by running an experiment saying that my hypothesis of launching this red color buy button has not been rejected at 99% confidence level. So I'm 99% sure it's going to be good for my customers. But this remaining 1% may be a very big problem in many ways.
Man, statistics, baby, here we go. So we won't dive too much into statistical significance, but this is such an important topic, which is that, and I'm eager to hear your experience with this, but often when we're very early in the stages of testing, statistical significance is not a luxury that we have, right?
Yes.
We're getting some leading indicator from like 20 as the sample size.
Yes.
Whereas, yes, in a much larger experiment, when we're testing something at scale, then perhaps we can start to say like, aha, like we can say with X amount of confidence that we're sort of right.
Yeah, that's right. So experimentation has been a luxury of the larger companies, obviously, up until recently. But again, like we live in a world where even small companies now enjoy millions and tens of millions of downloads. So I'm really excited because this item number 2 becomes more and more available to our smaller companies. You're exactly right that up until maybe $1 billion in valuation and like maybe millions in revenue and maybe millions in downloads, many companies shouldn't even think this way because it will take you so long to run an experiment. And also in many things are just obvious at the qualitative level. Like your customers may not be happy about your page speed, or your customers may just want like certain feature, and it's just so obvious. If you place 10 calls, 9.5, like 9 people will tell you, and like the last 10th will not tell you explicitly, but you can conclude that that person still needs it, right?
Yeah.
So this number 2 is for ultimate impact, like Google, Facebook, like you have to go there, right? Like you really need to get this level of sophistication into your product process. For smaller companies, you don't have to, but the more you can do it, the better you will be, right?
Right. So the way I've sort of seen this done at smaller companies, and there's actually 2 things I want to talk about here. One is an example of when I was at a tech startup and I was running A/B tests.
Yeah.
And an A/B test is where you have 2 versions of a product or service, and you offer it to your customers at the same time, so you can compare them to each other and ensure that all the other things that are happening in the world are not influencing the outcome of your experiment.
Right.
And when your sample size is small, you can't test like one little change
Right.
to see if it has the desired effect. You do what's called a kitchen sink test.
Right.
When you throw in a whole bunch of things all together, it's, throwing in the kitchen sink is where that comes from.
Right.
And you see if all of those changes together have the sort of desired effect. And you can still get to statistical significance, but not nearly at the same level of detail that you might have been able to get to otherwise. And then the other thing I want to touch on is how you think about this when you have an experiment that is qualitative.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're not really getting some big quantitative result, right? Like let's say you're doing customer interviews.
Yeah.
How do you handle or approach that?
That's another good question. So sometimes you can expand like the problem you're trying to solve. So by running an experiment, I'm not necessarily trying to understand which exact like option 1 or option 2 is better. So that's obviously a very specific reason you run it. But in many cases, when you run an experiment, which, well, not a large sample size and honestly completely insignificant, you can still use it to maybe build some awareness in your organization that, well, this is what we've done, that's how we evaluated it, that's what the outcome was, and basically build acceptance and maybe more excitement around doing things this way, because many companies still need to win the battle to even accept this approach, right? Like some companies come with the culture which is like experimentation focused, and they hire people who are obviously, again, scientific in their background, and they know the p-values and statistics and stuff, but like most of us do not, right? Like many functions in our teams do not need this skill set. The team has quite a number, like your copywriter does not necessarily need this, right? Your designer does not necessarily know what the p-value is. And in many cases, you can use those things to still build like confidence in your team that this is a good approach. And sometimes when it doesn't work, it's also an evidence that it's a good approach, because it's not one like, it's not a know-it-all kind of approach, because life is a way more complex. And your design team will even be happy that, well, thanks goodness this mathematician guy cannot prove all my designs wrong by just running an experiment.
So what I think is interesting here is that at big companies,
yeah.
Both the quantitative and the qualitative results are useful, but for different things.
Yeah.
Right. And the qualitative, it sounds like, is more for momentum building, consensus building, interest building, and pursuing something further. Whereas the qualitative or the quantitative is used to say like, okay, now we can move with much more confidence in the next level of experimentation or in building, because we've gathered this data that helps us be more confident.
Yep. So I would say the importance of qualitative, and again, I love that we're even getting there. Those are like really exciting topics to which like I still have just some opinions. I'm not an expert, and obviously those opinions are not the ultimate truth. So to me, the importance of qualitative is obviously very important when you try to call an experiment. And when experiment is still saying like, man, the data explicitly shows you it's a success. but you say, well, yeah, this particular metric seems to have improved, right? And it's improved by quite a bit and it's all significant, but my customer center support calls went up. And this treatment is causing lots of issues for some of the customers. So you may use it as another a factor which has not been accounted for by success metrics in an experiment to be more confident in saying yes or changing your decision to no. That's one way qualitative comes into picture. Another way is when you decide on your strategy in broad strokes and trying to understand customer problems, data is actually in many cases not a good way to understand those things, right? Like in Uber, for example, the customer level strategy gets shaped from largely qualitative insights. Like sometimes there is so much data out there. So which of this data is more important? It's really hard for you to decide. Is it more important to go for retention or it's more important to go for acquisition? And how should we be thinking about the strategy? So qualitative is really important at the stage of identifying the set of customer problems we will be going after. And then once this set of problems has been identified, then your whole experimentation magic comes into play and the data becomes very powerful. But at the biggest picture level, the importance of qualitative cannot be understated. You just cannot, like companies that only focus on data will be making lots of wrong decisions. It's just obvious, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What is interesting there is that the qualitative results help inform what these numbers really mean when we're looking at quantitative results.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you run an A/B test and the version you had created that you thought was going to be better fails.
Yeah.
Why did it fail? You don't know. Unless you were talking to people along the way or getting some sort of directional feedback, hard to say why it failed, right? You have no idea. So I very much agree that directional feedback is really important. So I want to refocus here on how all of this ties back into building for impact. And we've talked so far about first nailing the customer problem.
Yes.
Defining it, some amount of agreement around it, then experimentation, which is increasing our confidence.
Yes.
What's step 3?
So the largest item, the last, and probably even the largest one is the statement, put the money where the mouth is, right? You need to do what exactly you're saying. And for me, this means, and for the companies, it means you need to be explicitly aligning your company organization and your product and engineering organization to the customer problems and the customer needs. So this is, to me, this actually is a revelation. I didn't understand this thing maybe 1 year ago, 2 years ago. It's a very recent thing, which I'm still trying to even comprehend exactly the level of impact it's going to make on my decisions going forward. But think of it this way. Now there is lots of buzz around certain kind of things. Growth is a sexy thing suddenly. Machine learning is a sexy thing. Big data, AI, and just there is so many different things. And companies often have teams around it, right? Let's have a growth team. Oh, it sounds reasonable because we want to grow. Okay, let's have a growth team. How about machine learning team? It's such a great thing. So we need to have a machine learning team. And it may become a completely subjective process, right? Maybe your boss will decide, well, how about, it sounds great. Let's have this team, but not have this team. Or maybe let's decide how do we make decisions which teams to have, right? That's a very big decision from my standpoint. And the answer largely is, well, first figure out what problems your customers have. And by example of Uber, these days, for example, Uber has a driver team and a rider team. And it kind of makes sense because there is drivers and there is riders, right? And these days, Uber, again, maybe it now has it again, but when I was there, the growth team stopped to exist. And one reasonable explanation was there is one customer experience, right? And there is driver experience, there is rider experience. There is growth is not a customer need. So you cannot justify having this team from the customer needs standpoint. If you justify this team, it needs to be justified from other need. It may be a company need, right? But if the company wants to explicitly say, we're all about our customers. We really want to understand what you guys want, and we want to service you the best. And we're now becoming such a big company that it's really important for us, instead of focusing on short-term growth, focusing on your long-term needs. It actually puts, again, it's money where the mouth is. So it says okay, I'm not even going to have this team anymore, right? Because I'm not trying to grow at your expense.
I think that is interesting. And this is an entire separate topic of conversation we could have around how to structure a growth team and its relationship to a product team. But the sentiment that I like there is heavy focus on the customer and what the customer problems are. And
Right.
so it sounds like, and keep me honest, the sort of third, um, I guess, stage you have in being impact focused is that you actually have to design your organization around having that impact. So
Exactly.
identify the customer problem, experiment, and align around those insights.
Yes, those are the three things. Again, this is not a full set of things, but whenever I talk on this subject, I always talk about those three things first because they bubbled on top of my mind. I just cannot see what else could be more important there. But there is
And
obviously
so,
4, 5, 6.
yeah. And so impact in this case means that you've solved the customer problem, or talk to me about that.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So now we can get closer to the math because I'm ultimately like a math guy, and there is impact is a number ultimately, right? You cannot just say my impact is like, you need to assign a number to it, right? In many cases, it comes as $1 or it may be something else. $1 is the easiest way to measure impact, and market cap can be the one, the revenue can be another one. And like those are the ways you can start talking the numbers. And in my world, like, okay, let's for most of companies which are not public, we cannot talk about market cap, right? Like maybe there is some value at which investors value those companies, but those are not proven by market, so we cannot really talk about this thing. What can we talk about? We can talk about revenue potentially. Okay, revenue is generally number of customers times the amount of money they pay you, right? And in this framework, you can start saying, okay, so if I go for the largest impact, do I go for most customers or do I go for most value per customer in a way that like those two things multiply, right? And like at Stanford, for example, when they teach you VC class, they say you need to paint the path to 10 to the 8th degree like in US dollars in revenue, like $100 million. How do you get there? And there is like basically 8 major options. One customer pays you $100 million. 10 customers pay you $10 million each. And you just go through all of those options, right? And that's one of the ways you can think about impact, because ultimately investor return will depend on company hitting those financial objectives. And this also aligns, it has to align with the customer, because if customer pays you a certain amount of money, like they get certain level of happiness or utility out of it, right? You don't know exactly how much. And like, that's why I'm kind of making an understatement here. Like, it's not the ultimate approach to measuring impact, because Facebook customers do not pay anything to Facebook, right? Is it fair to say they're not getting any value out of it? Of course it's not. They're getting a lot of value, but Facebook is a lucky company that identified there is actually businesses who get even maybe even more value, but at least those guys are really happy to pay. Right?
So what I hear you saying, and this actually ties in perfectly with the example of Facebook, is that when we talk about impact, it sounds like we're talking about impact to either the financial model or business model that drives the organization. Right? And in some cases, that's revenue. And in other cases, that's not directly related to revenue, but might lead to revenue.
Right.
And I think this is interesting because it actually ties into the third principle of lean startup. And I'm very heavily sort of paraphrasing the idea here, which is that, look, like we don't necessarily exist to build stuff. We exist to serve customers. And along the way, we might build stuff, but the key is creating that impact. Right? And so how do we measure that? Well, that's through validated learning, which, again, like a whole other topic that we could really dive into. But okay, so now we've got a little bit better of a definition of impact. I'd love to hear some stories, actually, on really two different ideas. Talk to me about a time when you used this approach and it went really, really well.
Yep.
And then talk to me about a time when you used this approach and it really fell on its face, like something went horribly wrong.
Awesome. Let's actually start. I think people love failure stories way more than they like success stories. So maybe we can start with when, and it's not even a failure story. It's a story when this approach is not a guarantee of success, right? And then we'll figure out which of the success stories to say. But success stories are generally more boring, right? Oh, I did these things right and it all worked out. Like, okay, so where is the drama? There is no drama in this story. So to get into the catastrophes or not so successes, so look at the Uber driver app, right? And as an Uber driver, when you finish your session, right, when you're done driving, you generally, like, there is a feature, go offline, right? Do not make me available for rides anymore, right? So, and early on, when I just joined the team, our team was very focused on making drivers drive more, right? Because it's good for the company, right? It's actually very good for the company, and those hours, they unavoidably convert into trips. And generally, the more you drive, the more committed you are, the more likely you are to drive tomorrow. So those things are all very good for the company. In fact, like, we're kind of lacking customer problem here as well, like, because is it really good for the customer? On the one hand, you can say yes, because the more you drive, the more money you make. It's kind of obvious. But have you gone and asked those people, like, would you like to drive more or not? We not necessarily haven't done it. So maybe we haven't even checked the box on customer problem to some extent.
And by the way, in this case, the customer is not the rider. You're talking about the driver.
As a driver, correct. Your customer is a driver. Riders actually always want your drivers to drive more, because the more supply, the cheaper the price is, the faster the ETA. So you're right. When the customer, if you just ask a rider, actually the problem is justified. Yeah, I want those guys to drive more, right? But the question is, did you ask the driver? And that's a very big question, which we're going to get back to as at the end of the story. So we did run an experiment, like, okay, how about when people go offline, we'll ask them a question. Maybe you just want to keep driving more. Like, maybe you really didn't want to, like, go offline. It's like when you delete something, are you confident you want to delete it, right? So it's kind of innocent feature, which double asks you, like, are you confident you want to end this driving session or not? And can you believe this was an amazingly successful experiment? Obviously, people, as a result, drove way more. And we improved this feature even further. We said, oh, if you finish right now, you will finish at trip number 9. How about you drive one more trip? And, like, started doing all this type of things, right? Like, or if you finish now, like, you will be 15 minutes short of 5 hours for today. How about go full way to 5 hours? Like those fake goals, right? And it created another set of, like, improvements to this feature. So we invested quite a bit in this feature.
Yeah.
Long story short, so ultimately what we've learned is the feedback, again, there was impact on customer support, and the feedback, people were annoyed, right? Like, if you're a driver who drives a lot, like, you're kind of annoyed by this thing, and you will still keep doing it. It's not a reason for you to leave the company, right? But if I know that I'm done driving and I just don't want to take another 15 minutes and I just don't want to do the 9 to 10, just don't treat me like this, right? So those people went silent, and they, like, in this experiment, we didn't listen to their opinions, right? Because they just quietly pushed the button twice, but they didn't have a way to express their annoyance by this, right? And ultimately—
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
This is so interesting, because you've got data, but it's not telling the whole story.
Not telling you the whole story.
And you could get the desired behavior, but there was a consequence.
Correct.
Interesting.
Correct.
Okay.
And then for you to get the full story, so now that with all this experience, you think, how could we get this full story? So you do need to know what those people, some level of sentiment, like, so the number of hours you drive is actually not the right success metric, because it's just showing you at the moment what's happening. It's not showing you what's going to happen tomorrow. What if all these annoyed people tomorrow just don't come, right? And suddenly you just stopped your experiment before they got so annoyed that they decided to actually stop coming the next day when you switched your experiment off, right? So they didn't even give you a chance to measure this. So those questions, like, that made me learn quite a bit. It shows you that, first, data is backward looking, right? It doesn't tell you what's going to happen going forward. Second, your success metrics, you need to be super careful about them, because it shows you a response from some people, but doesn't show you response from other people. And then the qualitative insights is, like, sometimes a net promoter score or some level of sentiment, like, do you like this feature? Of course, like, if people hate it, like, they would just tell you explicitly, I hate this feature, right? So you would be given at least a chance to listen to those people if you ask them for a sentiment. So yeah, those are all my learnings, and ultimately this feature is obviously not in the app anymore. So now if you want to go offline, no more questions asked. So you can judge that, yes, the company made a decision, what's not good for the driver should not be there, even if it creates a short-term benefit. But yeah, that's one of my big learnings, where it all sounds reasonable, right? Your rider customers obviously welcome this type of feature because it gives you more supply. Your company seems to be enjoying the feature because there is more supply. But you know what? You just didn't design the experiment exactly right, and you get basically the consequence of this. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because theoretically it should impact the bottom line of the company, right? Like if the driver's not coming back the next day, or works fewer hours the next day, or whatever those negative perceptions had led to.
Right.
But the challenge, and this is a complex topic as well, is how do you account for all of those influences and those outcomes? And this, we can group into the idea of innovation accounting, which is another sort of lean startup principle, which is how do we really tie one action that we took back to all of the outcomes that happened as a result of that action. Right. And to your point here, it is really tricky to measure all of those different things. And the sentiment in this case was a really good pointer.
Yeah, and it's more of an art than science. That's what we're all getting to. As much as you want to build science, like the human judgment cannot be replaced by just a set of processes. That's one big learning you get. And over the course of your career, and again, having success stories and not so successful stories, you will learn to predict those things and you will orient yourself better. And like your approach should be get smart people around me, get some people who like have good judgment, and also talk to your customers all the time, right? When you even launch it. So there is no mechanical approach that would solve for this. You need to be always on alert. You need to be measuring your data, but you need to be measuring qualitative insights, and you need to have some sound judgment. Like you still may have failures even after like 30 years of successful experience. Like that's always possible, right?
Yeah. So for the sake of time, I want to skip the success story for now. We might come back to it.
Yep.
So let's say we're kind of convinced at this point that we like this idea of building for impact and making sure that we're not just shipping features, but we're getting the desired outcomes as a result of shipping those features.
Yep.
How do we shape our team or our organization in order to actually create a world in which people can operate that way? And I'll give a little color to that by saying, for instance, in the world of agile software development, you've got a product owner who sort of owns what will go ahead and be built, and they're writing sort of feature specifications, but they don't have the time of day to go kind of run experiments typically, right? Like they're being held accountable for building stuff, and that the team is going and doing all of this work, less so that necessarily the desired outcome is obtained. So like, how do you create a situation? And by the way, I know that example is not true in all places, but how do you create a situation in which you've actually got the time of day to go run these experiments and collect this data? Yep. And how do you shape an organization so that it can be more focused on impact?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll be, I guess, trying to answer some of those questions without having a full clue to this. So we'll
yeah. No, I'm not looking for the absolute answer. We can have a dialogue around it, right? Like, what things would you tweak?
Right. So first of all, I think it largely depends on exactly the company you have and exactly the customer need you're solving and exactly the life cycle. So you may need very different people, even at the same company, at different phases of a life cycle. And you see this a lot, right? Like startup, one team comes, executes, and then management changes, the team leaves, new set of people come, and then management changes again, and then people change. So even within company life cycle, there are waves and waves of people who come to help this company, and those are very, very different people at each point in time, right? Generally, I would say at the startup phase, when you need to either make it or like figure out what you're gonna do next, right? You need a different level of skills than when you try to company which is already successful to try to get it more successful, right? You can argue again in startup, all your experimentation skills may not be as useful simply because there is not enough data, right? You need to come with a sound judgment and maybe conviction that there is a problem the world needs solved, right? And you just need to go full way, full speed, solving this problem, like no questions asked on like if it's a right call or not the right call. We're gonna know like a year after or 2 years after if we survive, right? That can be like a good approach for startup founders. In many cases, they just don't spend like days and nights thinking, oh, is this experiment performing or not, right? They go talk to customers, they solve hard problems, and they just, with conviction, they build certain thing they believe should work, right?
Yeah. Well, let me ask this a different way. And I'm interested in sort of based on your experience, how you might approach this. But let's say someone who's listening today says, you know what, this sounds really interesting. I want to try to do this at my company or with my teams or whatever. How do you recommend that they get started?
I got it.
What do they need to do?
I got it. So from my standpoint, is of all of those three things, problem statement, I think it's just a good hygiene for whatever we do to always explicitly discuss what problems we are solving, right? And I'm doing it more and more explicitly with like every single like non-product and non-tech team that I engage, because in many cases, especially when you have internal customers in your company or when you talk to your customers like directly, they tell you what needs to be done, right? And in many cases, like the advice to the startup founders to go talk to your customers, what do they want? Oh, they want this feature built. Okay, let's go build this feature. So I just want this whole conversation to become a little bit more advanced. And instead of asking what needs to be done and like asking for what you actually want me to do, ask like, tell me more about like, what are you doing right now? What your problem is? And sometimes you don't even ask explicitly what your problem is because like you may get the wrong answer. You need to learn to poke in very different ways. Like, tell me how you engage with this feature today. Tell me what you're missing in my product. Tell me what you're using in other companies. You need to learn asking those questions, which will ultimately make you more powerful in identifying the problem. Yeah. And then ultimately, like, explicitly state the problem statement on the customer level and the company level, because I'm now trying to even get 2 problem statements each time. Like, tell me what we're doing for the customer, tell me what we're doing for the company. Because if you ask customers, they want everything for free, right? And like, should we get the prices down to 0? Well, probably not, because the company is not going to be happy, right?
So I can see how this is going to map onto the 3 steps that you were proposing earlier. But step 1, if you want to do this, stop thinking about solutions,
right,
and start thinking about identifying cleanly and clearly both the customer and company problem you want to solve.
Right.
Okay, then what? Let's say I've done that.
Yeah, then what? So then I guess instead of experimentation, I would put prioritization as a framework, because, and maybe planning, we didn't talk about planning here, but it's another concept which is very closely ties to the amount of impact you make, right? Even if, as Mike Tyson says, you will get punched and those plans will all get trashed, but still planning is very important.
Yeah,
as well.
I'll jump in with that Mike Tyson quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Correct.
And I have a friend who likes to say, so the goal with lean startup is then to get punched in the face as early as possible.
Yeah, and also learn to persevere, right? Maybe you need to go do some boxing, like learn.
Okay.
Yeah. No, those are all good discussions, because you will get punched, and like it doesn't mean you don't need to plan, right? So Mike Tyson's quote also needs to be understood correctly. Some people just say, "Oh, this means planning is useless," right? But in fact, the plans are largely useless, but planning is everything. I forgot to say that. It was one of the famous warriors, I guess.
Actually, I think I saw that quote earlier today.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay. I'll have in just a minute who authored that quote. But
yes.
Okay, so now we're talking about the planning process. So
and prioritization. So those 2 things, instead of experimentation, so those are the 2 replacements, I guess, to experimentation in the original framework, to what do you do now, right? You plan and you prioritize, because those problems, like, hopefully you will identify thousands of them, right?
Mm-hmm. So now we're changing the way we prioritize to be more focused on, instead of deliver solution X or deliver solution Y, it's which of these problems is more important for the organization to solve.
Correct. So the problems, they will have the importance metric, or at least priority metric associated with them. They might be sequenced one against each other. They might need to be combined, like, because sometimes you can get 2 problems solved more efficiently than solving like 1 and then the 2. And like, yeah, so the planning process helps you in several regards. First, it helps you prioritize, right? Second, for when there is multiple teams, those teams often clash around, like, should I be solving this problem or should you be solving this problem? No, it sounds more like my problem, but you're actually stepping on my territory. So those things happen unavoidably in large organizations, even when you do everything well, right? Each team goes and identifies the problem, maybe runs its experiments. It still does not prevent all the clashes, collisions, and conflicts of interest. And in fact, sometimes bad behavior happening, because there is a land grab strategy where each team tries to like claim as many problems as possible, because again, we live in the real world, teams get combined, like reorgs happen. So there is lots and lots of org implications to like the rules that you define, right? So the planning is something we haven't discussed before, but it's really important from organizational standpoint to get the organization more targeted to achieving big impact. You want it to be aligned not just around customer needs, but within each team, you need to figure out like which team is solving which part of the customer needs. So that because there is always like bad consequences of not planning things well and not prioritizing things well.
Got it. Okay, so moving through this, if you're trying to be more impact focused, cleanly defining the problem, prioritizing, and I think you've started to touch into the next thing a little bit, but prioritizing and rallying around those problems instead of launching specific solutions is how you would kind of get started doing this?
I would say so. Like, yes, I cannot imagine building successful product org without like focusing on problem first. I'm very black and white about this. Again, it can work for many startups, right? You just convinced in something and you do it and like you succeed. Okay, it can happen, but like 90 other people will not succeed. So just like plain numbers. Yeah. For the large mature companies, there is no excuse to not do this, right? It's just irresponsible to you.
Well, you'd be surprised how many companies would fall into that irresponsible bucket, because look, it's a lot easier, I think, for companies to talk about solution X or solution Y or solution Z.
Right.
There's a number of reasons for that, but often I also think this happens because someone very, very senior says, go give me solution X, right? Yeah. For whatever reason, they think it's a good idea. And they actually, that person probably wanted to solve a specific problem, and they just had a solution in mind that they thought might work. But what happens is instead of somebody testing it to confirm that it works, the team goes and says, well, the CEO said, go deliver, widget XYZ. So we're just going to do it, right?
There is one other funny actually aspect of this, telling people what to do instead of like why and what problem they solve. Like it can also go through lots of broken phone issues, right? Because in large organizations, the ask can bounce like in a number of different teams. Like your executive can come to one team and say, do this for me. And the team will figure out that they were actually a wrong team. They'll come to somebody else and then they'll bounce it to some other. And in each of those bounces, basically, the ask changes, right? So So by the time the feature is delivered, even if executive wanted something really nice, right? And he knew what the problem is, he just didn't bother explaining it to everyone. There is a very good chance, and we've seen those Dilbert cartoons, right? Like one thing is being asked, completely different thing is being built. One way to ensure you, again, against those things. And when you talk about why and the problems, like those things are way more complex. It's way more difficult to like make them sound very different in the broken phone, right? Like when it's obvious, like I'm trying to make my customers happier by doing this, it's more likely to get unchanged to the ultimate team, which will be implementing it. So the solution will be like more precise, if you don't mind, right? So that's another way communication straightens out in your organization when you talk about problems.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
Before we sort of summarize and start to wrap up, is there anything else that you want to chat about with regard to sort of building for impact?
It's a good question. I think we did cover like lots and lots of things. Obviously, you can go deeper in any of those, in each of those. Okay, so what specifically do you do to discover the problem? Because we only touched on like top of the iceberg, right? There is so many different frameworks for discovery on problems. There is double diamond, so you need to like even like before you figure out which one problem you're solving, there is basically a recommendation to first explore 50 different problems and then decide which one, right? And it's called the double diamond framework. So you first can like diverge and converge on problem statements. You try to first diverge, like what kind of problems could we go, and then converge. And then solutions, you diverge and then converge. So all of those specifics, they will determine success of your organization because like nobody still knows the right way of doing those things. It's important to identify the problem, but how you do it, like there is no clear like winner. There is a design sprint concept, which is again an amazing concept that takes you to final solutions in a very quick time with like broad consensus in your team. There is again lean startup approach to many things, which sometimes it works and it's really, really good, right? But sometimes you need to challenge even the lean approach, which is so fundamental, right? Like it has, for instance, I'm just actually, given that it's a lean startup conversation, I think I'm passionate about this topic. So there is a very important assumption in lean that resources are limited, right? And you need to de-risk your company as fast as possible with as minimum resources as possible. So some of our companies actually have unlimited resources, even if it sounds crazy, right? The cash is
Yeah. Well, so this is an interesting topic, right? So many people interpret lean and they hear that word and they think cheap, but lean actually means efficient.
Right.
And sometimes it is very efficient for a large organization to spend a lot of money. Right. Depending on what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to learn.
Right.
So yes, that is an interesting topic to sort of hit on, is this idea that we're necessarily trying to save resources, which is not always the case.
Right. Yeah, and I think so. I hear a lot like MVP, the minimum viable product, for example, which is also a natural
danger topic.
Huh?
I was just saying danger topic. Most misunderstood term in technology.
Yeah, but that's where it takes us. We can have a separate conversation on just those topics. What I want to say here is even the most like coined and well-accepted terms, you need to adapt for yourself, right? Does it work for me or not? That's, I guess, where we should end. Like, I'm not trying to give a very specific advice that's here is what you do. The only advice I'm trying to say is here is how you approach things, but I'm not trying to say that you're going to be successful if you do it, because the how it does not determine the what, and the what is going to be your choice, and in many cases your choice will determine success. The how can be right, but the what will determine the success, right?
That's right. So perhaps this is a good point to sort of summarize. We've covered a lot of ground today, talking about driving for impact and making sure that what we're building actually has the intended outcomes, and that we're not just sort of building for building's sake. And the way that you might go about doing this is to focus much more on the problem, to run experiments to confirm that your understanding of reality and the solution approach you want to take actually looks real, and to sort of align your organization around some of these insights so that you can go deliver against them and get some of these desired outcomes. Anything else that you would want to share with viewers before we wrap today?
No, I think it's great. And just, guys, you need to be curious. You need to keep learning. Like any advice you get, it's possibly very useful and great, but it's all about you. That's also something you need to learn all the time. Even when the most renowned expert comes and tells you how things should be done, just like doesn't necessarily mean it. Like things change so fast, the advice from 5 years ago may be like very irrelevant, right? So it's all about you. You need to learn, you need to be curious, and you need to build framework for yourself that's going to be impactful for you, right? To build your impactful products going forward.
Amen. Run the experiment for yourself. Give it a shot, see how it works, learn and refine as you go. Vasily, thank you so much for your time. We really enjoyed having you on the show today. For those of you that have questions for either me or Vasily, you can reach us at elliot@leanstartup.co, ELLIOT@leanstartup.co. Again, we really enjoyed having you on the show, and thanks so much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, guys.